thank you all for coming to our penultimate session. We're very pleased to have three great speakers who are taking us off today's session. He works at the Oslo Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's a research analyst for the director of the German Advisory Council on Global Change to the Federal Government. And Kira is going to start us off, followed by Tom Skogi, who doesn't need introduction because he's spoken plenty of times over the course of the next few days. And then we're going to finish with Jaap Speer, who's the Advocate General in the Supreme Court of the Netherlands and honorary professor at Maastricht University. All of these folks are going to talk to us about different aspects of climate change mitigation, related issues. 15 to 20 minutes each, and I will enforce the upward 20 minutes limit experience.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be able to speak here today. And as you can see from my first slide, I will talk a little bit about climate impacts, about climate migration and justice. So first I want to start with a slide that sort of shows a different story of human civilization than we all know. So we all know the stories of kings and queens, but this is a very different story. This is the sea story of human civilization, the carbon history. So let me start with this. So what we see here are the cumulative human carbon dioxide emissions, and they are measured by 1 degree longitude by 1 degree latitude. And there's a time running, as you can see on the left-hand corner. So we start in the 1750s, and we see that for a long time, industrialization is limited to Great Britain. So it starts in Great Britain, and for a long time, nothing really happens. So this industrialization started because of advancements in the textile industry. And then a second player comes into effect, that's Germany. And then it quickly spreads, industrialization and the burning of fossil fuels throughout the European continent and also to the United States. Then we even see on the western United States how the industrialization and settlements spread from east to west. So this is a scale that is logarithmic, meaning that the cumulative emissions that are very red are several times of the magnitude of the lighter colors. And yes, you can see that now Britain is getting darker and darker, and Germany, France, Poland, it's all in a sort of yellow-reddish color. And India has come into play, Russia. And so you can see how this is also advanced by the development of railroads. You see Australia. Now we're heading towards the end, and what you can see is very interestingly so that two players are really coming towards each other, or they are both becoming very, very red, which is Germany and Great Britain. And we are heading now into the First World War. At the same time, we're now in the First World War. At the same time, now Latin America has also started to burn fossil fuels. Still, most parts of Africa black, and Australia. And now we're heading towards the Second World War. And you can see actually also the players like Japan and the United States, Germany, Britain, they're all becoming very red. And these are also the main protagonists of the Second World War. Now we're already in the 60s, and you can see that there's another sort of spread all around the globe in the 70s with the advancement of technologies, and now we're coming towards the 80s, and we're entering into another acceleration that sort of begins with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which just happened, and then it takes off again. We see a lot of emissions, especially also from China, again United States, and then we stop at 2009. That's how far we put the data in, and you can see some parts of the world are deeply red, some not so much yet, and the question is how we would like to continue this development? Do we want to turn the whole world red? And I assume the answer is no. Sorry about this. Yes. So where has this taken us? Here you can see on the x-axis the cumulative total organic emissions since 1870. And on the left-hand side, you can see the temperature change at that time. So what we can observe here is that the historic emission, that is the black line, that's where we got so far. So 2010, we are currently a little bit below 1 degree above pre-industrial levels in temperature. And if you see here, this is the pathway that would keep us below 2 degrees by the end of the century. So we can see the budget that we still have left right here. And this is the pathway that we're on right now. This is going what we call business as usual without any significant mitigation. So this would lead us by the end of the century somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. And this is a significant change in our Earth system. It has various impacts. So what are the risks of such a development? On the left-hand side, you can see the global mean temperature change again in the business as usual and a 2-degree scenario. What I want you to focus on now is the right-hand side and the associated risks. So if we pull the 2-degree line right here, we can already see that also under 2 degrees we have somehow moderate risks. And this graphic explains why it's so important to stay below 2 degrees to keep risks at a moderate level compared to 4 or 5 degrees, where we're just in this very, very red or even violet area where we have high risks. So the first one are unique and threatened systems. These are ecosystems as well as cultures. So these are systems that are already under threat, such as coral reefs. Then we have extreme weather events, such as coastal flooding, heat waves, and precipitation. We have moderate risks currently, but this will also increase if we have another degree of global warming added to the current level. Then we have the distribution of impacts, which mean that people are unevenly affected by climate change. So, in general, one can say that the risks are greater for disadvantaged people from all stages of developing countries. So in any country, the most disadvantaged groups are the most vulnerable to climate change, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. The global aggregate impacts shows the risks on biodiversity as well as the risks on the global economy, which means that the losses in biodiversity translate into losses of ecosystem services, which we are heavily dependent on as humans. And then the fifth corner here on the very right-hand side are large-scale singular events. In these events, we have such what we call tipping points. These are changes that are very abrupt, that maybe come from small external disturbances and cause the whole system to shift into another state of being. So if we look at extreme events, so such as heat waves, this is what a 4-degree world looks like. So here you can see the percentage of months in 28 to 2100 that are hotter by at least 5 sigma. 5 sigma events are events that would occur in a normal climate only once every couple of million of years. So these are virtually absent from our climate. If we increase the global mean temperature by 4 degrees, you can see that in some areas, such as Central Africa and other tropical regions, these events become the new normal, which means 100% of summer months, June, July, and August, are now hotter today than by at least 5 sigma. This has significant risks. So we can see here, this is a report that has been done for the German Advisory Council in 2009 They tried to map here what are some security risks, some examples of hotspots and security risks. So you see risks of environmentally induced migration, the decline in food production, problems of water security, and problems of storm and flood disasters, which also may lead to migration. So some of these risks seem to have already turned into an actual state of being. So this is a study that has been published this year. It is quite interesting because it describes it analyzes the drought that has happened in Syria preceding the conflict that is now currently still going on. So what has happened is that in Syria there was about a 3-year drought that was the strongest drought in Syrian temperature records. And this drought was 2 to 3 times more likely to occur under the current degree of global warming. This drought caused many farmers to migrate because they could not sustain their livelihoods in the areas they were living. Then they migrated into sort of the peripheries of Syrian cities, where they lived mostly in informal settlements and slum regions. And the food prices were still rising because of this drought. This drought was also mismanaged, the water management was not very effective, and the government did not provide for them to live adequately in the Syrian cities. So these people started to protest, and then a civil conflict erupted, and this has affected the entire region. Another problem is the sea level rise. So here we can see that the sea level rise also is distributed unevenly. So we see a disproportionate sea level rise around the equator. And this is one of the effects of this is the death toll of Typhoon Haiyan. And what has happened there is that the typhoon was accompanied by a very strong storm surge, which has to do with the sea level rise. And people did not know what a storm surge was in that particular region of the Philippines because it had never occurred in that region. So actually also the measurements, the evacuation shelters and such, they were all inadequate. Some of them were actually in the area that was affected by the storm surge. So the storm surge was something they had not seen in a normal climate. And in the Philippines, the sea level rise has been disproportionate, so it caused also a storm surge to be much higher. These are some pictures from my own research in southern Bangladesh, which has also been affected by an increased frequency of cyclones, especially very intense cyclones. So, and these as you can imagine, this is a typical sort of rural community, and if a storm surge comes, these houses are very much affected, and it's very hard to survive if you live in such a house. And the dikes are not very high, and yeah, it's a very vulnerable situation. This is more inland, and here we see that a lot of the places inland have also been affected because Bangladesh is a very low-lying country naturally already, and especially when the monsoon season sets in, we have a lot of flooding there. And with the rising sea level, we see more of these problems, and people are going to be very affected, also because Bangladesh is densely populated. So a lot of these people we talked to, they migrated from these very vulnerable areas, which were vulnerable due to the socioeconomic situation, due to the differences in the climate that are now occurring, and also due to population pressure. So they're migrating into the cities. However, the cities, they were hoping for better income opportunities. The people we interviewed, they did not necessarily find them. And also the cities are vulnerable themselves. As you can see here, some of them are also built in very vulnerable areas, and the living conditions are rather problematic. If you look at the migration crisis, and if you look at projections for climate migrants, so people who have to move because of climate change, either internally or across borders, we think that, oh, maybe our emissions are not so much. Germany is, for instance, a small country. However, if we calculate up to our emissions, under the 2-degree guardrail, we have so far used up 1.5% of the global share of emissions. And if we go by the emissions reductions targets that Germany has proposed, which are very ambitious compared to other countries, we still have about 3% of global emissions that we are responsible for. If we assume 200 million climate migrants, which is sort of the number that has been going around, it can be higher. It is just sort of an approximation of where are vulnerable areas and would people probably migrate from there. Then you would have a hypothetical responsibility towards 6 million migrants, which is of course much more than what we're seeing right now being intaken by Germany or European Union. And this is a lot of people. And yeah, of course, this is just a hypothetical responsibility because most of these people will relocate within national boundaries, or they will relocate to a neighboring country, and these are likely not to be neighboring with Germany. So this is something I was thinking if I should repeat it or not, but I think I wanted to show that this topic of climate change is very deeply connected to what we have talked about previously. So we have seen this graphic, or we've seen this number in different forms in this conference, and this advertising of the Evening Standard from Oxfam. And at that time, that was 2014, when this was picked up in the London Tube. The world's 85 richest people own the same wealth as the 3 billion poorest. But surprise, now it's 67, as we have talked about. So also on the right-hand side, you can see the income distribution, which also shows the same sort of situation. So why is this important? It's important because it directly links to the distribution of who's responsible for the situation and who's responsible for emissions. So as you can see, these are CO2 emissions by wealth. So you can see in the x-axis people in millions ranked by the wealth of their country, and on the y-axis the cumulative emissions. So what you can see on the left part of the curve is flat, meaning that poor people in average, people from poor countries in average, contribute little to global emissions. On the right hand of the curve, it's steep, meaning that the lifestyle of the average individual in rich countries contributes a lot to global emissions. So maybe I will skip this part, we're short on time. So what I wanted to show you is what we need. We need a change in the development paradigm. So this is the sort of baseline scenario, and it's sort of a comic that I want to show you. So on the x-axis, you can see the per capita CO2 emissions per year. On the y-axis, you can see a development indicator. In this case, it shows mobility. And then the coins represent people, 100 million people, each coin, with a low, medium, or high income. So you can see that people who have very high development, very rich, they also contribute a lot to have very high per capita emissions. And we have a planetary guardrail. So I'm assuming that we are all somewhere on this side of the graph. So we're, with our living standard, living outside of the planetary guardrail. So we're consuming too much in order to keep the safe operating space of the Earth. So our current development paradigm is this. So we're just pushing people over the planetary boundaries. We say, we consume more, we want to build a new middle class by sort of pushing them over the boundaries. And it has worked for a little while, it might work for a little longer, but what we will see is, eventually we'll see this. So this is what we think is going to happen, that eventually this will lead to a risk-free society, because the poor will definitely fall back. They will not be able also the middle classes will fall back. They will not be able to develop under a changing climate regime. They will not be able to adapt to the outcomes of climate change. Then maybe the very rich, they are able to adapt, and they are maybe able to also sustain their development. So what we need is this. We need change. So we need to have the upper middle classes move back. They need to bend the curve. So it is us who need to mitigate. First of all, because of the fact that we are the ones who contribute the most to carbon emissions, so we have to reduce our emissions. And second of all, because we have the financial resources to do so. And then we can hope for this, where we lift more and more people out of poverty. And the poorest, they can even go a little bit around above the planetary guardrail. So we need to open that space up for them for development. But this means that we need to find a different way of operating. And we need to help middle-income countries and lower-income countries and groups to also take that same path. So I will stop here as we're out of time.
Justices from Supreme Courts or retired justices from Supreme Courts, distinguished practicing lawyers, and a few people from law schools, including our own Jill Silvey from Yale Law School. And we drew up a set of principles and a very lengthy legal commentary. All that has been published in the book and is also freely downloadable from the website of the University Program. So I will give a brief introduction to the basic idea of what these principles are, and then here we'll talk in more detail about the legal underpinnings. So I'll start off, given that we are close to the philosophy department, with our good friend Immanuel Kant, who, as you all know, had something called the categorical imperative, which in one version reads, act only on that maxim, whose universality as a law you can at the same time will. So what this means is a little bit obscure, but here is the basic idea. One must be able to will one's maxim, the maxim on which one acts, together with its universal permissibility. And maxim is a general principle of conduct, and it has three elements. In situations of type S, I will perform conduct C in order to attain end E. So that's a maxim, and maxims can fail the categorical imperative test in two different ways. You can have a contradiction in conception or contradiction in the will. Contradiction in conception is that you do a thought experiment. If you say, if everybody took my maxim to be permissible, what would happen? Well, what could happen is that a lot of people would adopt that maxim. People would like it to be permissible. They would then adopt it. And as a consequence of adopting it, the end of the maxim could no longer be attained. So one maxim that Kant discusses in this context is the maxim of making false promises. Right? You say, well, if that were available, that would be very convenient, right? I would make false promises. I would get myself favors from other people. They would give me things in exchange for my promise, but it's a false promise. I have no intention of keeping that promise. Now, if that maxim were generally permissible, a lot of people would like to avail themselves of that nice opportunity. And then, of course, people would no longer trust such promises, and the end of the promise, namely to convince people that I'm serious and to get favors out of them, reciprocal favors, that end could not be attained. So this is Kant's own example in the groundwork, the second example that he discusses. Now, contradictions in the will are somewhat different, which he also discusses there. Here the idea is that if everybody took the maxim to be permissible, then again more people would adopt it, and this would defeat an end that we as rational beings necessarily have. So here we have to bear in mind that the German word for rational, vernünftig, means more than the English word rational. It's not just taking appropriate means to given ends, but it also means taking ends. And so reason has to do with the adoption of ends. And among the ends that a rational being necessarily has is the continued progress of the human race. So that is something that it's too long to go through the whole reasoning for that, but the basic idea is that we cannot will the human race to die out, or the human race to stop its progress. So the idea is then that one must not act on a maxim that, if it were permitted to all, would end the persistent progress of the human race. And the maxim of emitting as much as one pleases is one such maxim, because as we've just seen in Kira's presentation, if emissions were unlimited, they would rise to unsustainable levels, and human civilization would at least be seriously endangered. So then the question is, what does that mean for each individual agent? And the answer, again, would be that each of us has to constrain our emissions in such a way that if others constrain their emissions likewise, the catastrophe would be averted. Now, states come in insofar as the coordination could be achieved only by states. States formulate these duties, and states can also enforce these duties. So without the coordination and enforcement function of states, we are not really going to solve the climate problem. And that means we have to structure our states so that they limit per capita emissions of their residents in such a way that the universal permission of equal per capita emissions is compatible with the persistent progress of the human race. So each state imposes within its own jurisdiction a limit on per capita emissions, and if all states enforce that limit, then we will stay within reasonable boundaries. And of course, these reasonable boundaries, as we see, or as we have seen from Kira, is, to the best of our knowledge in the moment, the 2-degree guardrail. So, and that's what scientists now tell us, and the moral argument sort of takes cognizance of that, that we have a reasonable chance of averting climate change that would derail the persistent progress of the human race. We have a reasonable chance of averting that if we stay below the 2-degree line, 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. And I should say here one thing that Kira didn't make completely clear, I think, which is that the temperature increase, there's a certain inertia in the temperature increase. So she said rightly that we are now at 1 degree, roughly 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, but the existing CO2 in the atmosphere already puts another ½ degree into the pipeline. So this other ½ degree is the equilibrium state that we would reach if we stopped polluting now and if the existing level of CO2 remained the same. So the situation is in that sense a little bit worse still. And so in order to stay below 1½ degrees, we would basically have to stop polluting right now. No more CO2 into the atmosphere. Good. So the most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, CO2. And since the beginning of the industrial era, we have increased the share of CO2 in the atmosphere from about 280 parts per million to over 400 parts per million. So we have just this year broken through the 400 ppm threshold. And in order to respect the 2-degree line, that is to say, in order to get to a point where the equilibrium will be no higher than 2 degrees more, we must not exceed 450 parts per million roughly. Again, that's the current state of knowledge, and that might be adjusted with additional information. In order to stay below 450 parts per million, we can put into the atmosphere another 800 gigatons. Again, you had a slide which showed that that is roughly the right number. So 800 gigatons of additional CO2 we can pump into the atmosphere and stay below the 2-degree guardrail. We are currently emitting 37 gigatons of CO2 annually, which works out to 5 tons per person per year. And if we continue at this rate, we'll break above 450 parts per million in 2036 or 37. That doesn't mean that we'll break through the 2 degrees at that point. What it means is that 2 degrees will then be no longer avertible. We may break through 2 degrees only 40, 50 years later, but we'll basically put it in the pipeline and make it more or less inevitable, barring some big adventurous technological feats such as geoengineering. So if we break through that threshold, through the 450 ppm threshold, we will very likely break through the 2 degree threshold with a certain delay. Now, the 450 ppm threshold can be respected if we lower our carbon emissions by a constant percentage each year, so a smooth path of reduction. And we can calculate what that smooth path of reduction is, right? As you know, the sum of an infinite series of percentage declines still works out to something finite. That's Achilles and the tortoise. If you remember Achilles running after the tortoise. Anyway, so if we reduce every year by 5% and do that for all future time, we will only emit a limited number of carbon, and a 5% reduction is what's needed in order to keep the total emitted below the 800 gigaton threshold. And if we hold fixed population growth, which is roughly 1% a year, it's a little bit less at this point, but just to keep the numbers round and easy, that would mean the per capita emissions have to decline by 6% each year in order to achieve the 5% reduction in total emissions. So, and then what we postulate in the Oslo Principles is that states ought to reduce their emissions, each of them below a glide path that falls by 6% per annum in per capita emissions from 5 tons per capita in 2015. So the glide path for the world is 5 tons per capita, falling by 6% a year, and that's the glide path that all countries should be on in order for these burdens to be fairly distributed. The ceiling, just to give you a sense, we would get down to 2 tons per capita in 2030 and 1 ton per capita in 2041, and we'll then reduce further from there. So we would gradually decarbonize our economy. Now, states, of course, cannot do this immediately. Just to give you a sense, again, the United States is now at 17 tons per capita. Australia is even higher than that. Canada is at roughly that level. The Middle Eastern oil states are even much higher, as high as 39 tons per capita. Europe is on average around 9 or 10 tons per capita. Germany a little lower, the Netherlands a little higher. The Chinese are now at 9, but of course they vociferously complain that this is partly for export. So we shouldn't count the stuff that they're exporting because that's really consumed elsewhere, which is not, of course, totally plausible, because if we subtracted that, we would take away any incentive from them to produce the stuff that they export in as non-polluting a way as possible. But anyway, that's a different topic. So the states that are above cannot immediately get down to the 5 ton per capita threshold, but what they can do in compensation is, of course, go down as quickly as they can to the 5 tons or lower ceiling, and they can also help other countries, in particular countries that are still below the 5 tons, to decarbonize, that they don't even build that whole technology, right? We shouldn't now be building tons and tons of coal-fired power plants in India and China and so on and so forth. And so if we can, as countries that pollute more than the 5 tons per capita, if we can extend financial help, technological help to the countries that are below 5 tons, then we can in that way compensate for the fact that we are still continuing, at least for a while, to engage in excess CO2 pollution. So as a general matter, we formulate the Oslo principles as a legal argument, and so we don't officially stand on the science. We are just simply taking the science as we find it. And as you probably know, there's a very high degree of consensus among the best scientists. There are a few crackpots out there, well-paid crackpots, who are saying that climate change is a hoax and so on and so forth. But everybody who's serious and who's studied this and who has arguments that withstand peer review is saying that there is anthropogenic climate change, and people agree to a very high degree of accuracy on even the numbers. Now, a high standard of living is still possible, so we can decarbonize. How many? 5. Oh, it's a lot of them. So we can decarbonize, and we can still maintain a very high standard of living. And we can do that by varying 2 parameters. One is we can use less energy, and a huge amount of energy that we are now using is wasted. We could make do with a lot less energy than we are now using. We've already begun to make progress in that direction. Our cars have become much more efficient, right? I used to start out when I was a kid with a 13 horsepower car or something like that, a Fiat Cinquecento. It was my first car. The second was a VW Beetle, 13 horsepowers, 34 horsepowers, and they ate up almost as much gasoline as an economy car today, which probably has 60 or 80 horsepower. So the thing is, cars have become more efficient, but we could do a lot more in that regard. Of course, we could get electric cars and so on. So we can use less energy in many ways. Bulbs is another example where we have saved a lot. In transport, we can recapture some of the energy that we are using to accelerate. We can capture it when we brake, and so on and so forth. So there are great economies to be had in terms of energy. And of course, we can change the composition of sources of energy from fossil-based to sun, water, wind, and so on and so forth. So we don't have to go back to the lives that we had before the industrial era in order to solve these energy problems. On the other hand, if we go beyond the 2 degrees, that would have catastrophic effects, and Kira did a great job in outlining what they are. We would have sea level rise by several dozen meters, shortages of food and water, extreme weather events, spread of tropical diseases, mass extinctions of animals and plants, to mention just the most serious. So I conclude with the question, is positive law really so reasonable? So I've not given you lots and lots of legal paragraphs and so on. That would be Yashvir's job. But what I've given you is an argument, essentially sort of a reasonable, plausible philosophical argument that's based in either Kant or in the Golden Rule or something of that sort. And you might say, is the law really that reasonable? And my general answer consists of these points. First, I'm not saying that this argument, as I've presented it, is clearly stated in the law. All that we are saying is that it's well-grounded in legal documents. And what we should bear in mind here is 3 points. The first is that law is generally taken to be complete. That is to say, the law settles the deontic status of any conduct. The law is not sort of agnostic about anything. If a case comes up and the question is, was it permissible for Joe Schmo to step into this space or to make use of this object or something like that, the law never says, I don't know, I have no idea. The law always has to have an answer to every question that comes up. And sometimes the answer is very clear. It's stated, paragraph 69. But often the law has to be interpreted, and you have to find analogies, and you have to look around at other bits and pieces of law. You have to look at precedents. You have to look at the opinion of the most distinguished jurists, called opinio juris. But the law cannot afford to simply say, sorry, we have no answer. Because these questions are practical questions. They arise in the real world. They need to be solved, right? Who does this belong to? Who has the right to do this, and so on? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when positive law doesn't provide the answer directly, then judges have to go and interpret. They have to look around to other parts of the law. They have to use analogies, something that fits, something that is sort of related, relevant, legal text, precedents, opinion juris. And third, this interpretation that lawyers and judges in particular then use is of course informed by reason. You try to interpret the law in such a way that it makes sense, that it fits together, that it's coherent. And that's what analogies do, that's what generalizations do, and so on. And here you have to also pay attention to whether it makes moral sense, whether this is something that a reasonable legislator could have intended, right? What could they reasonably have had in mind, and so on. And that is, of course, what judges do all the time. Here, the law must not be bent or distorted or perverted. It must be interpreted in a way that makes sense, that makes the law as a whole fit together, have integrity, in Dworkin's words, be coherent. So that's the answer to the question of, is the law really so reasonable? The best interpretation of a legal question makes the law as reasonable as the legal texts permit, no more and no less. And for our question concerning the climate duties of states, we can draw on different kinds of bodies of law, in particular human rights law. Human rights will be massively endangered if climate change comes about in this dangerous way, way above the 2-degree guardrail as is now threatening. There's international law, environmental law, tort law, private law, and we've drawn on all of those and had experts in all these fields in our group. And even if you just look at human rights law alone, it shows that states must have climate obligations, because if all states were free to emit as they wish or allow their populations to emit as they wish, then, as I said, human rights would be massively violated. Thank you.
It's a great privilege to be one of the co-presenters of the Oslo Principles. Why did we start to work on this project? There's quite a lot of debate in the legal arena about climate change. And many of those writings are very, very important, and many are very impressive. But there is one black spot. Don't answer the question what the specific obligations of states and enterprises are. How much must state X reduce its emissions? And that question is really needed. We really need to answer that question, otherwise we can't make any progress. And one of the easy excuses these days is that states may argue, well, we understand that we must reduce our emissions, but can you please tell me what we have to do? And why is that the case? So far, there's very little, at least seen from a legal angle, and we have tried to fill that gap. Our principles emphasize prevention. That's not to say that we take the view that compensation issues are unimportant. But all of us believe that prevention is of the essence. We really must do the job together. We must avoid that we pass the fatal threshold, otherwise catastrophe will set in. And the longer we wait, the more catastrophes we will get, and the higher the losses will be. So prevention is really of utmost importance. On top of that, opinions diverge a bit on the question of compensation, so we have left that aside. Already mentioned by Kira and by Thomas, we have to avoid that we pass the fatal threshold of 2 degrees. And to get there, we have to discern the obligations of states and enterprises. We have up to a level of 100. Put differently, 100 is the still acceptable level of tolerable global emissions. Thomas already mentioned how we have to get at the figure per country where we have to end up. For now, I stick to the observation that we can't carry forward our reduction obligations. We really must start right now. And that's also very important because, as we all know, reality is very different. So far, most states pay lip service to the good cause, are telling that they will reduce their emissions to the extent needed. That's bitterly needed, and it will be done, but they don't do it. And that must change. Let me secondly assume that there is still room for 10 greenhouse gas emissions in a given year. That figure, 10, has to be divided by the world's population. The resulting figure is the acceptable level of emissions in a specific year per capita. Then you can multiply that per capita figure with the inhabitants of a specific country. If the real emissions are above that level, that country is what we have labeled an above permissible quantum country. And such country has to reduce its emissions to the acceptable permissible level. That may not work immediately. Thomas has already mentioned that point, and he is very right. It's perhaps regrettable, but we have to be realists. It may be impossible for quite a few countries to get at the acceptable permissible level straight away. If they can't achieve that immediately, they have to take countervailing measures, either by exploring safe alternatives such as carbon storage, assuming that that is safe, or they have to provide financial or technical means to other countries to do that part of the job they can't achieve themselves. For practical purposes, this means that the least developed countries do not yet have reduction obligations. Quite a few of the developing countries do not yet have reduction obligations so far, with a few exceptions to be dealt with at a later stage. Other developing countries do already have reduction obligations, albeit considerably less compared with the reduction obligations of the rich countries, the above permissible countries, and almost, if not each, rich country is at this very moment an above permissible country. We have ignored the issue of emissions that have been brought about in the past, a topic that was discussed by Kira. That is an important topic, and Thomas and I have learned when we presented our principles at various occasions at many venues that this is one of the criticisms. Why didn't you take into account the emissions of the past? We understand that criticism. And the answer to the question, perhaps not a fully completely satisfactory answer, but our answer to that question is well, we understand that there might be a moral reason why you should take the emissions of the past into account. But seen from a legal angle, it is terribly difficult, if possible at all, to determine how you should cope with those emissions of the past. Theoretically speaking, we could interpret the common but differentiated responsibilities maxim. But it is so utterly vague that it doesn't answer the question how we could cast in legal terms what the implication of the emission of the past really mean. So we have left that aside. We also realize that our per capita approach is challenged by some countries. Seen from their perspective, understandably so. Some countries have advocated that a much better strategy, a much better answer would be to focus on emissions per unit product. Needless to say, countries would advocate that strategy would be well served by focusing on emissions per unit of product. That would indeed be a possibility, but in our submission there is much more support for a per capita approach compared with any other yardstick. So we think that that really is all in all the best solution. All countries must also reduce their emissions to the extent that they can achieve such reduction without relevant additional cost. As such, that's probably not controversial. But our interpretation of this principle may well be controversial. It means, in our submission, and that is at best a very unsatisfactory position. It would, for practical purposes, mean that the law is doomed to play a role only in relation to, relatively speaking, nitty-gritty cases. That's rather unsatisfactory. But also in legal reasoning. Take, and that goes for many countries, take personal injury. There's case law, well-established case law in very many countries around the globe. That if I expose someone to a very small risk of personal injury, and that risk materializes, then I'm liable for the personal injury caused. That example is about personal injury of a single person, and it is about a risk. Climate change is not about a risk, and it is about the most serious consequences for humanity ever. Well, of course we realize that those examples are not entirely similar, but it seems fair to strike a parallel. And finally, but that's really a legal argument, if you look at case law in many countries, not all countries, but many countries, if you talk about injunctive relief, i.e. legal orders to reduce emissions, causation often does not play a role. One other point. Needless to say, many countries will argue, yes, we realize we must do this, but not now. We don't have the money. We already face severe budget cuts, and there's a financial crisis. We have just experienced droughts, or excessive rainfall, and so on and so forth. So, yes, but not now. That, in our submission, is no excuse whatsoever. Lack of financial means can't serve as a defense. Only excessive hardship or extraordinary circumstances beyond the state's control can serve as justification for non-action. And what does that mean? Well, assume that the country is devastated by an earthquake. Yeah, that of course may well serve and will probably serve as a justification for non-action for at least some time. But the overwhelming part of mishaps will certainly not. I would be have been very happy to tell you more about the principles, but my time is over, I'm afraid. So I have to stick to this. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand before you quote. Raymond.
Kira, where did you get your data for your first slide covering 250 years?
Yeah. So the data is from the, I think, US Department of Energy. It's a study by 3 scientists, and the map is by NASA, and the visualization is by our institute. I can send you the exact name of the article if you wish.
So thank you very much for your interesting talks. I have a question about the underlying moral intuitions. Job Spear brought into play the personal injury risk, and I was thinking of a case like there is a firm and it's polluting the water in the river, and down the river there live some people and they get cancer from the pollution. So of course in a state law would say, well, the firm should stop polluting that river, and that would not be a question of can that reasonably expected of the firm. It would be strictly forbidden, and I think that's what you were saying, well, we should stop right now, and we should not compensate. That means giving the people some money in order to cure their cancer or whatever. We know the situation, we should stop. And I think morally this is quite clear, because it's harming to pollute the water, people are dying from the pollution, and that would be morally quite clear what there is to do, and I think legally also. At least in the US, for example, the firm could be sued and it should stop or then compensate. Is that the scenario we are facing? Or is the underlying scenario different? That there are the people down the river, there's the firm, some of the people down the river, they're working for the firm. It's not in their best interests that the firm closes down, so maybe the risk that is taken is, at least in the short-term interest of all the parties that are in the game together. And then it's more difficult to morally assess what to do and how to distribute the burdens of getting the situation any better. Because maybe, yeah, in my second example, the people down the river, they would say, well, we should not close that firm down. Our standard of living in the whole area would sink. So what do we do in the second scenario, and which one is more adequate to describe the climate situation? So it's a question to all of you, and also to Kira, because if you could elaborate a little more on the final concluding remarks from your presentation, what scenario that would be that would really be sustainable. Yeah, or to Thomas, because you said prospects, well, high standard of living is possible, and it's combinable with sustainable standard of living. So, yeah.
So let me make a start maybe. There's a well-known moral and legal principle in Latin, volenti non fit injuria. That means that to the willing no injustice is done. Right? So with your consent, I can do things to you. Now that principle, it seems to me, is somewhat problematic insofar as you always have to So if, for example, I invite you on my yacht and we go out to the ocean and so on, and you go for a swim, and then I sort of drive off to a little distance and say, by the way, if you want to come back onto the boat, you have to enslave yourself for life or something like that. You may agree to that under this duress, but I don't think this would be legally enforceable, and nor would it obviously be morally appropriate. So the baseline can be tainted, and if the baseline is tainted, then all the consent in the world isn't going to overcome the sense that that's an injustice. And so if we could run your scenario now with the climate change, we could say to the poor countries, look, we have in our infinite generosity, we have done the MDGs, and we are reaching out, and we have lifted people, out of poverty, $1.25 poverty, many of you, and so on, and others will be lifted in the future. And in recognition of that, why don't you sign here on the dotted line, and in exchange for our getting you to the $1.25, we will, we'll do that, and you will give us consent to pollute the world all we like. Something like that. I think that would not be an appropriate defense of our conduct, even if we could obtain such a consent, because the conditions under which we ask for such consent are conditions that we control, that we have produced, and that are, of course, deeply unjust conditions. Deeply unjust in light of two things. First, deeply unjust in light of the economic structures that produce vastly more inequality than would be necessary, and life-threatening inequality at that, for those at the bottom of these inequalities. And secondly, because the existing distribution of populations over this highly unequal global income and wealth distribution is deeply affected by historical contingencies, such as slavery, genocide, and so forth, which determine who is where in this very skewed distribution. So I think even if such consent could be obtained, it would not be valid.
Many legal experts, among them our friend and colleague member of this group, Michael Gerard, have certain parallel with asbestos and tobacco. And personally, I think that that parallel is quite convincing. Very much the same happened. And courts around the globe have issued judgments to the detriment of the asbestos industry and to a lesser extent the tobacco industry. But even if there would be consent of a small group of people, there's most definitely no consent from the overwhelming majority of the population of the world. The people in Africa, Latin America, and Asia will most definitely not consent that we put them at very, very serious risk. That they will get ever more and ever more severe hurricanes, severe droughts, excessive rainfall, and so on and so forth. Finally, short-term perspective may play a role in the legal debate, but that is certainly not the case if we look at the climate change situation. And that is that we can avoid major catastrophes for a very, very long time to come at a relatively small cost. But in such a scenario, it is simply unacceptable morally and legally to adhere to a short-term view. It's not to say that no court, no lawyer will take that view. Some will. But it would
since part of the question was directed towards my last slides. Yeah, so the industrialization was based on fossil fuels, and the fossil fuels are private goods, so they're either owned by governments or companies. So, and this is somewhat also based on geological coincidences where these fossil fuels lie. And so this means that your ability to have, for instance, electricity or energy also depends largely for many people on your financial capacity to pay for those. However, if we transition to renewables, usually there is a one-time investment for technology, and then the energy source is free because it's nature, it's the sun, or it's water, or it's wind. So, and if we want to look at how this could happen, we have to look at how do these emissions constitute themselves. So, where do the emissions come from? So, this is largely, first of all, energy supply. So how do we generate our electricity? Then it's transport, it's agriculture, and we have to look into who are the biggest polluters. Thomas, you mentioned on a global level reduction paths of about 5% annually. Of course, this is very unevenly distributed because there are some countries that have about very low emissions, and there are some countries who have very, very large emissions and are still increasing. So what is imperative is that we need to have sort of level off, reach a peak in emissions very soon globally, and then start reducing to zero by about 2070. And this means zero for every country and for every company, for every individual. So this is a great transformation. However, it is in my point of view, there is no other alternative because of the risks we are seeing. In a 4-degree world, we are putting humanity and human civilization at great risks. And we do not want this future, and we have already gotten a taste of it with just this very, very moderate increase of temperature that we're experiencing right now.
Yes, thank you very much for these interesting presentations. My name is Anna Leosic, and I have a question to Jens Stier. You said that there might be more arguments for taking historical emissions into account, but that it is legally very difficult, and for these difficulties you decided to leave historical emissions out of the picture. So I don't doubt these legal difficulties, and I could even see more reasons for limiting the responsibility for historical emissions, as for example, lack of knowledge, or also that historic actors are not identical with actors today. But insofar as the economic success of certain countries today and the standard of living in these countries can be traced back to historical emissions, insofar as this is possible, can we really leave historic emissions out of the picture altogether? And if we have to, for pragmatic reasons, how can we compensate for this injustice?
Well, first, thank you for the question. We are not saying that those emissions should per se be ignored. In our view, this is an issue for international negotiations. This is something for the international political arena. They may be unable to solve this problem, but that in itself doesn't mean that we have to take it on board. And as to compensation, well, we deliberately ignored compensation for the reasons I already mentioned. 1 minute, my personal view, but it is not supported by every member of our group. I have sympathy for the idea that quite a lot of the evil that has been caused and is still being caused has to be compensated. But let's be realistic and let's think about what that really means. Even if we would reduce our emissions to nil today, as Thomas has already observed, the situation will worsen. And already these days, we experience ever more serious consequences related to climate change. And we know for sure that the losses will be so colossal that it is very, very much open to debate whether any country or any enterprise would be able to pay even its proportional share. It's not to say that there should be no compensation whatsoever, but then we are not so much in the talking about what the law could do in this respect. We are more on moral ground, and well, that was not the topic of our exercise, but I'm sure that Thomas is keen to add some things seen from a moral perspective.
Yeah, just a tiny thing perhaps. I mean, the complication obviously is that there is a problem with the agents, right? So people, your great-grandparents may have polluted more than my great-grandparents and so on. So it's difficult to, they are not around anymore to be held responsible. What you can say is that those people who are current residents of countries that are historically great polluters probably still benefit from, economically, from the fact that capital was built up and industrialization happened and so on and so forth. And the way we finessed that, we discussed this at great length, the way we finessed it is to say that this is not something that we want to take account of in our calculations, but we do want to say that, of course, the obligation of states that are now polluting excessively above the 5-ton per capita limit, the obligation of them to get down to 5 tons as quickly as they can, and in the meanwhile to help other countries decarbonize, becomes all the more stringent given the fact that they would be fulfilling these obligations with resources that they have partly as a result of having overpolluted in the past, committed and so on and so forth. I am not convinced of that at all, because I think that violence is very highly counterproductive in almost all cases, and so it's certainly not permitted if it doesn't promote the cause. Anyways, you didn't speak about violence, you spoke about civil disobedience, and I think that civil disobedience is definitely a tactic, a strategy that we should consider in the fight to get our governments to comply. We have taken a different tack. We have said, let's see what the courts can do to get governments to comply, and that strategy may also succeed, but of course, given the uncertainties, it's good to try different strategies and to try to work through the political system.
Yeah, I had a number of thoughts. First, I think the exercise is very useful, and putting all of this discussion in this formal moral reasoning, I think, can only help. I think, though, that it can be better engaged with the actual processes that are underway right now. And maybe I missed some of that, but we have an international law, and we have an agreed international framework, which is the Convention on Climate Change. It's actually quite good. It expresses many of the most important issues that you have taken on. It calls for stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions at a concentration to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So it already is an international law exactly on this point. It's going to be negotiated in 6 weeks for practical outcomes. It has many of the issues taken up from also from an ethical point of view. That's what kind of the differentiated responsibilities were about. Annex 1 versus Annex 2, historical responsibility. So many of these issues have been debated for a long time, and I think confronting that would just make all of this more useful, because moral argument is good as a pure device, but it's also even better as a method of advancing a consensus. And so putting this in a discussion that is underway, I think, to my mind, would be helpful. Connecting it also with other moral arguments like Laudato Si, which is a moral argument that Pope Francis has made for taking on these issues, I think would be extremely important and very useful, because to my mind, Laudato Si, for example, is not from a legal point of view, but from a moral point of view, also trying to say what are the moral obligations, where do they arise, how do we pursue them, and he comes down also in the encyclical for a common plan for a common home, and it's not a Kantian deontic responsibility, but the church's framework, but I think it's relevant and related to this. When you get to from a practical point of view, I think also the 2 degrees C is useful, and it's worth noting that that's what the governments have agreed. So you're not pulling that out of thin air, that's actually part of the international legal agreement. All of this makes the arguments more powerful, not less powerful. It's not shouting into a void, it's basically saying we have to implement what is both the law, because it is the law of the land. It's actually the law of the United States under the reception of treaty law in the Constitution. It's the law of the world, because it's the international law that governs these issues. It's also 2 degrees is formally agreed under the UN Framework Convention. So that's quite a powerful fact, and it will be, I think, almost without doubt within the agreement reached in December as well. I don't think it's right to jump from that on a moral basis to specific conclusions like 5% reduction per year. Almost under any, that's an illustration, but almost under any pragmatic and therefore I would say moral consideration, the literal path that we would want would not be a 5% reduction per year, and certainly not 5% reduction per year jurisdiction by jurisdiction, because that wouldn't meet other criteria for what a reasonable path of reduction would be. You might say a reasonable path of reduction, in my view, would be a least cost path globally that is compensated across countries so that it's a fair path from a burden sharing point of view, but it's a least cost path from an efficiency point of view. So that's a reasonable criterion, seems to me. What would that mean? Well, it would look quite different from 5% reduction per year, but it would come to the same place. The integral of emissions would be similar, but some countries would do more, other countries would do less. It would be based on where the best options are, what the lowest cost approaches are. The fact of the arithmetic makes all of this not as hard as the debates have been, because getting to zero, which is really one of the boundary conditions that is quite real, means that basically everybody has to do this during the 21st century, and I think that's means that some of our debates are very unnecessary, because whether India moves first or doesn't move and blah, 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 in the aggregate boundary constraints are so tough that by the end of this century, all countries are going to have a very different energy system from the one they have right now. So we're really quibbling over details. Details matter. Having some principles about what those details are, I think, is important. Putting this in a bigger development context, I think, is also important because there are relevant issues that are important. I wouldn't say they're first order important for climate, but they are important. Take a very practical cases. Should impoverished country X be able to use its coal reserves? My view is yes. Why? Because in the global arithmetic of climate change, it's an insignificant issue. In the practical issue of the development of that country from extreme poverty, it's a very important issue. And so if you analyze that choice, should Mozambique be free to use its coal reserves right now? I'd say yes. That's, should the World Bank, what's the obligation of the World Bank vis-a-vis Mozambique? That is a pragmatic, day-to-day practical issue. Should the World Bank refuse to finance a coal plant in Mozambique? Well, under current policy, they've refused. Is that right? The answer could be, it's morally right, it's morally wrong to do that, except if they offer a better alternative. So the first requirement would be, you have to help this country have its energy resources, because that's the first criterion. Within that, if you're not going to finance a coal plant and the others are more expensive, you have to take on the added obligation to do the extra. These are not first order considerations from the global climate, but they're what everybody argues about on this issue. To my mind, you've got it right in the big picture, which is that we've been paralyzed for 20 years in this debate about who should move first and who bears the costs. That is actually the wrong way to think about this issue, because we're all going to bear the costs, and the basic lesson is that we all need a fundamental transformation. And quibbling about who goes first and doesn't go first, while it's been extremely important for the politics of this, it's almost irrelevant from the planetary issues. So you're taking the big picture and saying we've got to do this is right. On the other hand, framing it only like that doesn't necessarily advance the practical, it's accurate. So in that sense, it advances the practical consideration. Stop arguing about these things. We're all going over the cliff together unless we agree. On the other hand, these more refined points are also important because they have been, strangely enough, one of the major bottlenecks, not the only one. The other one is the power of the status quo interests to block things. But this debate about who bears responsibilities, who pays the costs, and so forth, has definitely been one of the primary factors in the lack of any kind of response. So I view it as the car hurtling over the cliff, and everybody's arguing about who gets to hold the steering wheel, and in the meantime, everyone in the car is about to crash because of this insane debate of how you manage the steering wheel. It's a bit relevant, I'll just stop here. As moralists, I think, and as ethicists, I think you can add to the debate about responsibility across countries. That's a good debate, and it can't just be ignored by taking the big picture. I would ignore it, in a sense, as a pragmatic feature. I say we all have to get to zero, so get to zero. And everybody should plan for this transformation and get on with it. So I like that, but I don't think that it advances the solution necessarily by not acknowledging that these distributional issues have been one of the two major sticking points over the last 23 years.
All of you want to say something about this?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to start just on a few points which you have mentioned. So for the development of the poor, they should be able to use, for instance, coal resources. This is what I tried to show in this graph with the coins.
I didn't see it. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I came in late.
Okay, yeah, so what I was trying to show is that it is the global elites, so to say, which are present in all countries almost, that need to take the first step towards mitigation. So we need to make the space open, the space within the planetary boundaries, so that the impoverished groups are able to use whatever they need to use in order to, for instance, get basic services. And this is also accumulates not to such big emissions as you have mentioned, that the electrification also of the poor, the basic services are not the problem. The problem is what the upper middle income groups are excessively using. Since you've mentioned the World Bank's decision on not financing coal-fired power plants anymore, I actually am in agreement with this decision, because I think, as you know, we have fossil fuel resources, about I think 11,000 gigatons of CO2 which have to stay in the ground, and for this it is, yeah, we have so much excessive resources in the ground that are able to be used, which we cannot use, that building more coal-fired power plants is just not leading in the right decision. And yes, then it needs to be done that we have a different path of taking renewable energies, for instance, and developing renewable energies and help people to leapfrog into not to leapfrog the step of a carbonized economy and use renewable resources. But I do think if we invest in coal-fired power plants nationally or abroad as development aid, then this will lead to stranded assets. It's just not a good way to go ahead, because we do have better options.
Okay, so I thought this was very helpful, very good, helpful comments. And of course, we should engage with the existing dialogue, and we are very heartened by the fact that the 2-degree guardrail is very, very widely accepted, and that's of course a good thing. As I see it, the big problem is that every agent in that space has really two interests. One interest is that the catastrophe be avoided. The other interest is that they themselves bear as little cost as possible in that thing. So how do you bear as little cost as possible? Well, you whistle and you pretend that you really don't care a lot, right? You say that actually for us it's not so bad. We like warm weather, and that other people, if you don't like, and so on. So you try to pretend that the cost that you would bear if it came to the catastrophe is relatively small, and so you should bear relatively little burden. Now, how we want to help the world break out of that and finally get something done, and this problem of distributing the obligations, who does what and how quickly, is by saying that there are legal obligations and get the courts mobilized in the fight to get governments to comply with these legal obligations. So that's really the innovation here, supposed to be the innovation here, because all this agreement on the world is collectively under legal obligation to stay below 2 degrees is really worthless so long as the countries do not agree on a particular way of distributing it. Now, with regard to the Mozambique case, I think that what you said at the very beginning helps us to think about that, namely this, that we are trying to find the most cost-effective way of getting down. The most cost-effective way, if we think about the world for a moment as a family, is that we use the gas, because the gas is we get the most heat per unit of pollution out of gas, natural gas. Gasoline or oil would be second, and coal would be last. And especially the brown coal, the dirty coal, would be last, because we get the least heat out of a given amount of pollution. And so then the second question is how to distribute the cost. And here I think Mozambique has to be made whole, that you say, let's keep all the coal in the ground as far as possible, and let's just pay the Mozambicans, deliver oil to them, or natural gas, or even better, help them get into solar energy, wind energy, and so on and so forth, in order to meet their energy needs. Of course, they have to be met.
Just to say, just a couple of points practically. At a practical level, Germany uses more coal, and Mozambique gets no electricity. So it's very important to be clear about what really goes on right now. And that's why there are these fights, because what is right in some sense is absolutely not within the range of actual decision making right now. So in actual decision making, Germany has an energy mandate, but since it's inconvenient to put power lines from the North Sea to Bavaria, it's burning more coal. And at the current moment, the World Bank literally has stopped financing power plants, and it hasn't offered any alternatives. So I think it's really important to keep this in mind, to just keep the context in which these discussions are taking place. Second, because we're all on the same side, I'm just trying to give the real, this is not arguments about what's right and wrong. This is arguments about where we are and what this discussion is about in practice. And I think it's important to understand that. That's why I said, if that's the current situation, I'd rather that be superseded by a practical decision. If you're not going to do more, then build your power plant, because if the choice is another coal plant, not in Germany, but in Mozambique I'm talking about, I would rather have the coal plant in Mozambique and the poverty reduced than the other way around. And so there's a context to all of this, and a set of responsibilities. This is not an issue taken only by itself. It's in a broader context. And that's what developing countries insist upon. That sure, by the way, another thing that I think is important to say is that in the poor countries, nobody's saying this is unimportant. Everybody's saying you're killing us. You're killing us by things we didn't cause. This is very serious, and we expected help. And there is very little help on the way. Even the $100 billion that has been promised per year is undefined as of 6 weeks before. It's not even 6 weeks, it's 4 weeks before the climate conference, and the rich countries, which promised $100 billion a year back in 2009, till this day have not put a proposal on the table about how that $100 billion is to be reached. So there's bad faith in this among the most powerful interests. This, I think, is really important to emphasize. This is not a good faith. And the bad faith is not among the poor countries, it's among the rich countries.